My name is Christy Israel, and I will be telling you an English folk tale about a boy named Jack. The Pottle of Brains. There once was a boy named Jack. Well, there have been lots of boys named Jack, but this boy named Jack was a bit lazy. But there have been lots of boys named Jack who were a bit lazy, but this boy named Jack, who was a bit lazy, had an old mother who worked her fingers to the bone and her bones to the marrow just to put food on the table for Jack. For you see, Jack was not very clever, and his poor old mother worried greatly about what would happen to him when she was gone. One day she came home and found Jack sound asleep in front of the fire. She had had enough. She banged her cane on the floor. Boom, boom, boom. "Wake up, Jack, you lazy bugger!" Jack sat up and looked at his mother, and he yawned. And he stretched his arms and said, "Oh, hello, Mother." And she looked down at Jack and said, "What's wrong with you, boy? Now, what's going to become of you, Jack, when I'm gone? Now, I want you to get up, and I want you to go right now, out the door, along the road, and up the hill to the hut where the hen wife lives, and when you get there, I want you to ask her if she's got a pottle of brains to spare. Do you think you can do that, boy? Now, mind you, be careful how you speak to her, for some say she's a witch, but if you're kind to her, she'll do right by you. Do you understand me? Go now!" And Jack scratched his head, and he thought that sounded pretty good to him, so he got up and he put on his coat, and he did as his mother said. He went out the door, along the road, up the hill to the hut where the hen wife lived, and when he got there, he tapped on the door. Tap, 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 and he heard from inside, "Come in, Jack." And Jack pushed open the door, and there, over in the corner, the dark corner, stirring over her great pot, he saw the hen wife, and she grinned at him, and she had 3 teeth in her grin, and she said, "How may I help you, Jack?" And Jack was very nervous, for he had never had any dealings with a witch before, but he gathered up all his courage, and he said, "Oh, me old mother sent me to see if you happen to have a pottle of brains to spare for me. Do you have any extra ones lying around here?" And she grinned at him, and she said, "Maybe I do, and maybe I don't, Jack. But first, you must go out into the world and bring back the heart of the thing you love best, and then we shall see if you have brought the right thing." And Jack scratched his head, and he thought this sounded right enough to him, and so he headed on home. And as he got home, he saw gathered around his house lots of his neighbors, and he began to be very worried about his old mother, and he ran inside, and sure enough, the doctor and the priest came up to him, and it's never good to see a doctor and a priest together, he thought, and they told him that his old mother was not long for this world, and he ran into her, and he knelt down beside her, and she looked at him. She was at peace, for she thought that Jack had finally gotten his pottle of brains, and she closed her eyes and was gone. And Jack began to cry. "Oh, Mother!" And soon his cries became wails, and his wails became sobs. "Oh, Mother, how will I live without you, Mother? I loved you best in all the world." And then Jack remembered what the hen wife had told him, and he looked down at his mother. No, he couldn't do that, he thought. So he looked around, and he saw a burlap sack on the wall, and he took the sack down and took it over to his old mother, and he began lovingly and gently stuffing her into that old sack, and then he tied it up, he slung it over his shoulder, and he set out to see the hen wife again, out the door, along the road, up the hill, to the hut where the hen wife lives, and when he got there, he tapped on the door. Tap, 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 and he heard again from inside, "Come in, Jack." And he pushed open the door, and there in the dark corner he saw her still stirring over her great pot, and she grinned at him with her 3-toothed grin and said, "How may I help you, Jack?" And he brought his old mother in and set the sack down on the floor and said, "Oh, here inside this old sack I have my old mother. And her heart's there inside of her body and inside that old sack. So do you think I can have my pottle of brains now?" And she said, "Maybe you can and maybe you can't, Jack, but first You must answer me this riddle to see if you have brought the heart of the right person. What is greater than God, worse than the devil? The dead eat it, but if we eat it, we die, eh? And Jack scratched his head, and remember, he wasn't very clever, and he said, well, I don't rightly know the answer to that. And she said, well, come back when you have the right thing, for she is not it. And Jack became very upset, and he took his old mother in the sack, and he slung it over his shoulder, and he started off back home. And as he got to the bottom of the hill, the weight of all of it, and of his dear old mother on his back, got to him, and he put it down, and he sat down there next to the road, and he just let it all out, and he said, oh, Mother, what will I do now that you're gone, and how will I get by, and I'm all alone, and I still haven't got my pottle of brains? Well, about that time, a beautiful young woman came along the road, and she saw Jack crying, and she felt for him, and she recognized Jack from when they were children together, so she went up to him, and she asked him what was wrong, and Jack told her the whole story. And she was a very clever young woman, and she had always heard that clever husbands made for bad husbands, so she thought perhaps Jack would make a good husband. So she went up to him and said, Jack, how would you like to marry me? And you can come back and live with me, and then we'll be happy always. How would that be? Jack scratched his head, and he thought that sounded right enough to him, and that's exactly what they did. They were married, and they buried his dear, sweet old mother. And then, one evening, as they sat lovingly looking at each other, rocking in their rocking chairs in front of the fire, he told her, Darling, I reckon I love you better than anything in the whole world, better than anything that... And he again remembered what the henwife had told him, and he started thinking about the butcher knife in the kitchen. Now his clever young wife could see what he was thinking, for Jack was never good at hiding his thoughts, and she began to be a little nervous, and she said, Jack, how's about if the two of us go on to the henwife together? After all, a beaten heart is better than a dead one. And Jack scratched his head, that's right, and said that sounded right enough to him. And that's exactly what they did. The two of them went out the door, along the road, up the hill, to the hut where the henwife lived, and when they got there, they knocked on the door, tap, 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 and they heard, Come in, and they pushed open the door, and still there she was, stirring in her pot, over in the corner. She liked to cook, that one. And she said, How may I help you, Jack? And Jack told her, Here, I have my lovely young wife that I've married recently, and inside of her is the heart of the thing I love best. Do you think I could finally have my pottle of brains now? And she looked at Jack and said, We shall see. Maybe you can and maybe you can't, but first you must answer the riddle. What is greater than God, worse than the devil? The dead eat it, but if we eat it, we die. Eh, Jack? Jack scratched his head. He became very, very frustrated, and he scratched his head some more, and he said, Bah! I still don't rightly know the answer to that. But this time his young, clever, beautiful young wife leaned over to him and said, Jack, say it's nothing. Well, Jack thought that sounded right enough to him, and he said, The answer to that is it's nothing. Well, the henwife started to jump up and down and did a dance of glee, for she had come to care for Jack, and she ran over and kissed him on the cheek with 3 teeth in her mouth, and she was grinning at him, and she said, Jack, You've finally gotten your pottle of brains. I have, he said, and he started to feel of his head, and he said, But it don't feel no different. Jack, she said, one sure cure for a fool is to marry a clever woman, and that is what you have done. Your wife has enough brains for the both of you. Now go and live happily together. And that is exactly what they did. They lived happily, and so may we. Now let's put on the kettle and have a cup of tea.